What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
As the host of the Bitcoin Rapid Fire podcast, John Vallis explores the future of money through the concepts that drive him the most, which are truth, freedom, curiosity, and possibility. John recently wrote a piece that was published in Bitcoin Magazine that really spoke to me, titled, "After an Unforgettable Year, I'm Most Bullish on Bitcoiners." Welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, John. How are you?
Said, excellent, man. It's an honor to be here. I'm a fan of your show, and I'm looking forward to this.
Wow, man. I really appreciate that. You know, to be honest, after kind of catching you on a few other spots over the last few months, you're my favorite Bitcoiner of 2020. I really like the way you speak about Bitcoin and, you know, these words that you're going for: truth, freedom, curiosity, and possibility. You know, maybe the great unseen. And so I heard you speak on some other spots, like particularly Nico's show, BitVolt, just kind of about where you were going with your life before Bitcoin, what you were trying to do. And I heard you on the Cosmic Deep Dive hosted by John Trudeau. And I was really blown away by the material you were covering there. And, you know, I think we're probably about a decade apart. And I think in this conversation, age is just a number and it doesn't matter. But I touch on that because, you know, you did these things maybe chronologically after me, but I think you took a lot of the feelings and emotions I had and took them further, and or just kind of had a lot of conviction. And I kind of like to explore that, if you will. And what I got from that is, you know, you were looking for truth in the world. The world didn't always seem fair to you, or it didn't seem to speak to you. The externalities seemed maybe a little darker than you'd wanted. So I'm getting at is you graduate college. I don't even know where you go to school, but you're like, I'm going to go into the world. I'm going to make money. I think you went into investment management. But what was really interesting to me there was that you jumped to China. And you wanted to see the future and you wanted to live it. And I'm really curious, you know, how big of a decision that was for you, what other things you were thinking about in terms of careers or locations, really, and just kind of some of the things you might have got from your time in China. What was it, the future? You know, I'm more talking about the 10 years that you were there, not so much where we are with China now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's, you know, I've always been, in hindsight, you know, like reflecting back on it, I've always kind of been anti-establishment, anti-authority. And not to say that I was like a troubled kid. Like I pretty much was able to maneuver my way by being kind of bad enough that I could have some fun and that kind of thing, but maintaining good enough relationships with, you know, older people that I could kind of smooth it over. I could always smooth it over. But that was always my sense. And I was always a curious kid. And I was fortunate as a youngster to have exposure to a lot of unique individuals, you know, both through travel and through, you know, my dad's occupation and the people that he came across. And so, you know, I say that only to kind of speculate why is it any of us are more or less curious? You know, it's kind of a open question. I don't have an answer to that. But, you know, as I grew up, money was something that I recognized as being kind of giving you access to the world, increasing your optionality, I guess would be the terminology we'd use today in Bitcoin that you hear a lot. And I also saw the stresses that money placed on my family growing up. And like I didn't want those, you know, I wanted to be free of those. And so I was focused on making, you know, when I was younger, I just wanted to be as rich as possible. But simultaneous to that, and totally unintentionally, was just this is the only definable moment I can really say that it really took flight from me. And, you know, because I think, you know, we're all just in the world trying to figure it out. So we all have a certain level of curiosity, of course. But I remember playing with one of the kids on the street when I was, I don't know, call it 11, 12. And she was my age, but she was ahead a year in school. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, I hate school. How are you getting out a year before me? And she was like, well, I just read a lot. And I was like, what the fuck do you mean you read a lot? That doesn't have anything to do with what we do in school, does it? And she was like, Well, I don't know. School was easier for me as a result. So they bumped me up. And so I never got bumped up in school, but I took that, as that kind of set my mind on fire. And I was like, this reading thing must have something to it.
Mm.
Uh, and so I went back to my dad's bookshelf that day and picked out a book. And I still remember the book. It was Hidden Power: Unleashing the Power of Your Subconscious Mind, which was quite an interesting book to start with, because I'd never considered even the influence of my subconscious mind till then. And so it was kind of revelatory to me, really. And it, probably served as a bit more of a foundation than I've ever given it credit to, subsequent to reading it. But anyways, so started reading a lot, and, really enjoyed that. And read like all the classic, Buffett and Graham and investing books when I was in high school, because I thought, the way to be rich is to work in money. You don't want to be a wage slave. You want to, basically make money by rent seeking off other people's money. And so that's what the plan was. And in high school, I did a Rotary exchange after high school. I was in Japan for a year. And it was probably around that time that I realized that China was the future. I think that was 2004 or 5. And, I'd done a lot of reading about China and all the books available at the time. And it was very clear to me that China was going to be, the 21st century was going to be China's century, as was, the US for the 20th century and the UK for the 19th century and so on. And Shanghai was the New York. And so I thought, I actually didn't want to go to university. I wanted to, actually leave high school grade 11 and just go. But I was corralled out of those decisions. In hindsight, unfortunately, but hey ho. And so after I finished university, I went down to South America and spent 3 or 4 months there. And, part of that was exploring ayahuasca and learning about that, and another part was partying a little bit too much and traveling around and backpacking and that sort of thing. And then there was no, to answer your question, there was no trepidation, or it wasn't a very well thought out thing. I just said, Shanghai is the New York of the 21st century. That's where I want to be. So I booked a one-way ticket, and I booked a few nights at a hostel and said, I'll figure it out. So I flew home from South America, switched out my bags, filled up my backpack with, a few different items, and booked a one-way ticket to Shanghai. And I mean, I wanted a job in finance. I put my resume around, didn't get anything. And then, I'm a diehard UFC fan. Guy on a forum said, we're watching the fights at a bar one night. I end up going to the bar, sitting next to that guy, and he ends up being, HR for the biggest expat wealth manager at the time. And so I got an interview, got a job, and worked in that capacity for a few years. And all the while, like during university, I had started to change my tune about like the kind of the principal aim in life being wealth accumulation. And, and that coincided with exploring the psychedelic realms, or different, let's say, aspects of consciousness via certain psychedelic substances. And, that that leaves an indelible mark on you. It's really difficult to have those experiences and not be changed. And I think a current of change was already happening in me, but that certainly accelerated it. And so it took a little bit of the hunger and edge and kind of, whoop ass and take names of my intent of going to Shanghai. So when I found myself in the wealth management industry, one, I was I was a bit disillusioned, because I thought it would be a little bit more sincere in terms of what the role of an asset manager is, but you're a glorified salesperson and you're told to sell basically. And that's the same pretty much everywhere. And so I ended up not liking the industry, not liking the job, but still wanted to be in China, because, this is where the Bitcoin narrative kind of has really impacted my life. Is I hate to say this, but my initial years in China, I kind of lost myself, which is weird for me to say, because I've always been someone who took care of my health and took care of my intellect and tried to learn and tried to grow and tried to continue developing myself and not be wrapped up in a lot of the things that, people can get wrapped up in, whether they be substance abuse or bad lifestyle habits or bad relationships or all that kind of stuff. But my assessment of the world at the time, from having, consumed a ton of resources about anything I could find about every industry and, how it all worked. We all try to piece together the world in our own ways, and that's what I tried to do. And I wasn't left with a great impression in terms of what was in store for the world. And so once the kind of kick-ass nature of my desire to go to China and work in finance dissolved away, I was a little bit left with like a bit aimless, I guess is the way to put it. And so I probably didn't treat myself as well as I should have during that time, but I still felt that China was the place to be. I still thought it was the future, and I thought there was opportunity there. And I loved the energy there. I mean, Shanghai is a modern city, and there's a great expat population, and the young local people are awesome. Like it's a really great place to live if you can handle the pollution. So, I stayed there, and I ended up going back to school for 3 years, and I studied natural medicine, and then I worked in that capacity in Shanghai also. But I guess it was in 2014, I came across Bitcoin, or finally finally got in. And then in 15, I interviewed Bobby Lee, who at the time was the head of BTCC, which was one of the longest running Bitcoin exchanges in the world. And he was kind of a, quote unquote, central figure or popular figure in the mix of Bitcoin. And that really started turning my perspective around, because, as is so often the case these days, when you hear anyone talk about Bitcoin, and I think Saylor has done a great job at amplifying that message, is Bitcoin is hope, right? Bitcoin represents so much hope for the future because it remedies so many of the fundamental issues that plague society and culture and, markets and economies today. And that started to dawn on me. And like I think is the case for everybody, you go down the rabbit hole and you say, this is interesting. And then you go a little bit further, you go, wow, this is really interesting. And then you go a little bit further and you go, holy shit. And then you go a little further and you find yourself obsessed and not able to really think or think or do anything else beyond the obligations that you have. And that's kind of what happened with me. And so I left China in mid 2018. I went down to Thailand and ended up meeting someone there, and we just basically have stayed there for over a year. And I find myself stuck in Canada at the moment with the COVID nonsense that's going on. But that's the Coles Notes version of the story. But I think the more relevant point, because that may have been boring for some, what Bitcoin has done for me is, it dramatically reorients many things in your perspective. But I kind of thought that like it was a fait accompli that China was going to take over the world. And it probably still is. Even if if everyone's on a fair playing field, like let's say it's a Bitcoin standard everywhere, I think that's probably still going to be the case. But because of Bitcoin, it's kind of reinvigorated everywhere else in the world. And like Bitcoin is everywhere, right? And so I can get my rocks off about being at the kind of the vanguard of something really a momentous shift, and one that, far more the case in Bitcoin than in China, is representative of a extremely positive change. I can be involved in that anywhere. And so part of the reason why I was in Shanghai is like, I just didn't want to miss out on it. I thought this was like a massive historical shift. And I kind of wanted to be at the center of it, right? I wanted to be in New York at the turn of the 20th century, or early 1900s, right? And now I don't so much feel that pull, because I think the big story, the macro narrative of our time, is definitely Bitcoin now. And Bitcoin is such that you can be involved in it anywhere. And so now it's sort of reframed in my mind that the most important thing, and the thing I most focus on, is maximizing sovereignty and freedom. How can I construct my life so that I have the highest degree of optionality and freedom to live, the life I want to, with my friends and my family and loved ones and all that kind of stuff. And that's the big story that I think is unfolding for a lot of Bitcoiners right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you said. And there's a lot to unpack there that I want to get into. One of the things you said, I think in the Cosmic Deep Dive is, before Bitcoin, the external world caused you to withdraw, and that there were bright and dark spots to that. And I really related to that in the sense that, I think in my 20s, I really wanted to find truth and fairness and freedom. But I think a lot about, the despair side of it, where I didn't think the world was fair. I didn't like a lot of what I was encountering in the external world. And I did withdraw. And I really waffle between whether I'm an introvert who built up extroverted skills, or I'm an extroverted who just reverted from the world and didn't want to deal with a lot that was coming my way. I didn't feel I could get ahead fairly. Like you were saying, that the best way seemed to get ahead was rent seeking. I remember in college, I studied finance. I learned all the tricks. I learned how, really big players made a lot of money. None of it seemed fair to me. I think that was one of the reasons I dreamed, growing up, I watched things like Family Ties. I wanted to be an investment banker, like Alex B. Keaton. And by the time I got there, I was like, I don't want to spend my life doing that, sucking, being a parasite, because I don't think that I recognize that while the intellectual capacity of maybe the globe was going to finance, that's not really what was creating value for the world. You were just moving around digits and monetizing transactions. But, I really, and so I think it made me in my 20s really think about, exploring myself. And I think that was one of the reasons I fell into things like, we would put in quotes, like partying or kind of making that kind of lifestyle where you're looking to be with your friends, you're living for today, and it wasn't until I think, without Bitcoin, I had a lot of despair. The world just seemed dark, and it didn't seem like a place you could get ahead unless you worked more than other people at some, hamster wheel someone else created, or, was a rent seeker. And that was just, not fun. And you just looked for fun elsewhere, and you lived for today, I think. But one of the things you said that really stuck with me is, you at 11 years old, you discovered reading, and you went to your father's bookshelf and you picked off, I never heard of that book, but it was a fascinating title for an 11-year-old or anybody age. And so I'm wondering, did your parents encourage reading? And what I'm getting at there was, did they encourage curiosity and truth seeking?
Yeah, I can't remember I think it was 11, 12, 13, somewhere around there, but that was definitely the book. No, they didn't. There was no encouragement of that type whatsoever. My parents, I think this is a positive thing. They've always been very supportive, which, all you can really ask for out of parents is love and support. I mean, because who the fuck knows how to bring another human being into the world, right? And what are the best ways to treat a fresh mind and mold it and form it into someone who's fit to go out into this crazy world and succeed and be happy? I mean, who the fuck knows how to do that? So, I think you got to default into just saying, did they love you and did they support you in the best way that they could? And in my case, the answer is definitely yes. But there wasn't much specific direction of that kind. They weren't like, hey man, you got to read in order to be smart and successful in the future. They just wanted me to go to school, be behaved, do well at school, and come home and not cause too much trouble. And that's what I did. But I think maybe why that worked for me is because it just gave me the space to explore on my own and to say, like, nobody's really pushing me in one direction or another. I get to choose, and I chose to. Like I said before, I think we benefit. I benefited from having certain people in my life as a result of both my family and my dad's occupation, who, in hindsight, like I can look back now and say they were very unique people. And I think for the right type of mind, which was mine, who would be curious about unusual people, I think that fed the flames of my curiosity to say, like, why are those people like that? And like, what makes them tick? And just getting different personalities and looks and types of people, exposure to them when you're younger, I think is beneficial, because you kind of see that it's not a cookie cutter approach to how, quote unquote, how people are. People can be a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different positive attributes and negative attributes that people have. And, to see that spectrum when you're young and to perhaps naturally gravitate towards one end of it, like the more curious, unconventional, anti-authoritarian, whatever, however we want to characterize it, that I think that was an initial push in that direction. And then, my own curiosity just took over and, led to this life.
Yeah. Was witnessing your parents dealing with money, and I'm not really digging into what their money situation was, but just, what money is to a family. And maybe, I'm assuming maybe your parents were really smart. They had smart books in the house, whether they encouraged you to read them or not. And yet money was still an issue. And I think that's why I remember when I was really young, I was probably about 7 or 8. Both my parents were public school teachers. And I turned to my dad and I turned to my pop and I said, I want to be a teacher like you. He kind of grabbed me by the elbow and he was like, I worked too hard. Don't ever become a teacher. And he wasn't telling me don't become an educator. I don't think that was the lesson. It was more about like, figure out a way to provide more for your family. I think, maybe his dream was to be like a lawyer and go into Manhattan with a briefcase,
Right.
but, and at the same time, I'm amazed with what they've been able to provide for me just by being teachers. And I don't use the word just there lightly. I mean, they busted their ass and I'm really happy with everything they've given me. But it was very striking to me that it was a little bit of a lesson of like, take care of yourself, I felt like. And he wasn't trying to teach me to be selfish. But I wonder like how much watching your parents deal with money was the lesson, maybe if they weren't speaking to you about it directly.
Yeah, it's definitely had a profound impact. And look, parents insulate their kids from everything they deem, that they don't want their kids to have to concern themselves with, for their own benefit. So I don't know what the financial situation was at the time. And to be honest, I'm not sure it matters much.
Yeah, I'm sure it was fine. Yeah.
Well, I've been privy to, extremely wealthy families that squabble over money and extremely poor families that feel the stress of a lack of whatever, of financial capacity or means or whatever. So it's almost like the nominal amount of money probably wasn't the issue. It may very well have been their relationship to money and to wealth and to their spending. And so whatever it was definitely something that, was very, very, kind of seared into my mind. Like I don't want to have that kind of stress in my life. Like I can tell that type of stress is unhealthy and that, that type of stress is just not good. And I didn't want it. And so I think that kind of fostered that desire to like really go after money. But as I said, like you can't help what you really believe, and this is something that you only learn maybe when you get older, or for most people, but you can't fool you. You can fool everybody else for a time, but you can't fool you. And that's the tricky part. And that's the part that requires courage when you come to that. A lot of people have difficult times in their life, and maybe it's a crisis moment, or maybe it's just an accumulation of experience where you say like, I've got to just step up and do what feels right and true to me. Right? Not to anybody else, not for any other reason than this is actually who I currently am. And this is the journey that I'm on, and the place in that journey that I'm at. And, that's difficult. And one of the things that gets me so excited about Bitcoin is that a big impediment to people being actually able to do that is the financial concern, right? Like I have to be Lawyer John because every day I go and be Lawyer John. And if I'm anything other than Lawyer John, I can't put food on the table. I can't pay my bills. I can't support my family, whatever it is. But with the people, Bitcoin is providing a very, very, very unique opportunity, I think, for people to put themselves in a situation where the financial concerns are becoming less and less, and ultimately, hopefully, no impediment to them expressing who they truly are. And, and I'm not saying that it's super easy. I mean, a big part of my development and all the traveling and escapades that I went on was trying to figure out and refine what exactly that was, and trying to explore. And like, we talk about looking out in the world and being a bit, concerned with how it looked and not very motivated to push into the future, that despair that you mentioned. And, a big part of my searching, traveling and trying different experiences and stuff was kind of me saying, surely there's more than this. Right. Like once you put together the piece of the world and you see, maybe it doesn't look so good to you, you come away with like, surely there's more. And I kept just following that impulse. And I refused to believe that the answer to that question, like there was no answer to that question. I maintain a belief that surely there was. And I think, so I'm not saying that it's easy to do, but I think a lot of people who are set free financially by, being involved in Bitcoin now and into the future, I think the degree of sovereignty that it permits is going to allow them to have the choice to actually become or be or express who they genuinely are. And I think that's huge benefit to the world, and of course it's of massive benefit to the individual, because there's nothing worse than having to act in a manner that is not genuine, having to be someone who you don't think who you're not. And that characterizes probably most people in the world today. And I'm really excited for more and more people being able to step out of that facade and start to explore and express who they really are.
Yeah, I can relate to a lot of that. I wonder how much watching our parents, like my parents were hardworking people. My father even had a second job, like working at flea markets and kind of just trying to provide more. And I don't know how much what we saw was their relationship to money as to inflation, because they were doing what they were supposed to do. And it was still a struggle to do and accomplish all the things that we wanted or needed. I use wanted and needed interchangeably there, but I know the difference. But it's interesting. You mentioned that you told a particular interesting anecdote, I think, in the Cosmic Deep Dive about, and I think it relates to what you were talking about, genuineness, where you came home and you were out drinking with your friends. And instead of kind of like telling your parents you're out having snacks with, Johnny and Tommy, you were like, this is what I did. I'm a little tired night now, and we could deal with this later. And that reference point, you were really, what struck with me is that you were like, I'm about truth. And if I lie to these important people, all I'm doing is forking reality, And I thought that was a really interesting concept. And I also wonder how much, like, are you like always been a wanderer, and are you still a wanderer? Or do you think you were searching for something and you might have found it? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you still feel that wandering spirit?
Right. So that story is true, and you said it perfectly. I can't remember how I articulated it at the Cosmic Deep Dive, but I've always felt that way. Like I always had a call it a reverence for truth, and it was, I'm sure there's maybe it's a little bit more complex, but the most simplest way that it manifested it in my mind was, if I don't tell the truth, then I've created a false reality, right? Both for myself and the person who I'm lying to. And like, I've always had such a burning curiosity and desire to understand reality, right? Like, I mean, this is what all this searching is about. And this is what, going into the jungle and spending time with, with psychedelic brews and that kind of stuff is all about. It's like trying to figure out what is really going on here. And it was repugnant to me to be complicit in the creation of illusion, into fostering more false reality than I already perceived there was, even at that young age. So, that's why I always did my best to tell the truth, even if it landed me in hot water sometimes. Now, in that particular case, it wasn't that hard because I was already caught red-handed, like I might as well own up to it because I wasn't getting out of it. But that is that, that has always been, definitely something that not necessarily intentionally, I just always felt really uncomfortable to do anything but. And to the second part, definitely a lot of wandering for that very reason. But Bitcoin's grounded me in a way. It's also it's caused a lot of my previous interests and education and knowledge acquisition, or whatever you want to call all of that, to converge on something that seems to be able to house all of those interests and all of that knowledge and really give it a gravity and really make it relevant. And so in a way, I think the wandering has maybe been exacerbated, but it's been far more focused, right? Like I don't have to tell you, the Bitcoin rabbit hole is very deep. And so like I don't feel like I'm consuming less information these days, and I don't feel like I'm contemplating what I know and trying to recognize patterns any less. If anything, I think it's more, because Bitcoin kind of, forces you to do that. But it's grounding in that I'm no longer searching for the thing. like I'm of my universe of like, really meaningful things. I'm happy where that is right now. I think Bitcoin is, well, not that it was ever going to be, because it didn't exist, at the beginning of this journey, but to me, it represents a tool that can dissolve a lot of that despair that I previously felt away. It can restructure and reorient both individuals, and as a result of doing that, the structures and institutions that we see in society. And then, once you begin to explore that relationship a bit more, you start to be not just relieved, but excited, because you understand the relationship between the money and the individual and the culture. And, that I think makes us all excited. And this term, the Bitcoin Renaissance, that we all often use, I think comes from a recognition that this can be the foundation for something amazing, incredible, extraordinary. And so why not feed into that? Why not give that your energy, your intellectual energy, your financial energy, whatever? Like, how could you not, basically, is where I'm at. So, and I love that, because in my search for meaning before, the psychedelic realms were probably it, right? Taking care of your body and being healthy and all that kind of stuff. But the apex was just the mystery of the psychedelic state of consciousness. Like, what is that? And even though we can't answer that question, you could tell that it was extremely personal, extremely beneficial experience. And that's kind of why I kept going back to that well. But it's almost like it's imbalanced if you only kind of derive meaning, not to say only derive meaning from that realm, but to hold that realm or that experience up as like the apex. I think it leaves a lot to be desired in meat space, in the physical world, because you can have this, godlike experience, but you come back down and the world still looks the same. It doesn't change anything. And so my greatest hope prior to Bitcoin was that I always believed the world could change in an instant, because all that needs to happen is people need to change their minds, and then we'd have a different world. But practically speaking, well, that's not very practical. I mean, how do you get 8 billion people just to change their minds on a dime? And it seemed like the forces at work at society, like, yes, there was bright spots, and maybe even the brightness was growing, but there were also, big dark spots, and that seemed to be an insurmountable obstacle. And Bitcoin has come around and embodied a lot of those principles, actually, that are represented in the psychedelic realm as well, of, individual responsibility and individual sovereignty and control, control over your own domain, and represented that in the quote unquote physical realm to actually be a tool to foster a lot of those things, to take individuals who are like-minded, and I kind of hate this term, but let's say awakened individuals, people that are kind of waking up from the malaise of the cultural conditioning that so many people are subjected to from the time they're born, and saying, something's off here. How can we make it better? I think Bitcoin represents such a great tool to foster that. And so you put those two things together, and I feel like we're kind of attacking it from both sides, and simultaneously, because of course neither one is restricted to one domain. But of course, what I love about Bitcoin, and what I love exploring with people that I talk to, is how Bitcoin is changing people, and not just their financial circumstances, and not just how much optionality they have to move around and that kind of stuff, but like, why is it affecting what you eat, and how you treat your body, and who you spend time with, and your aspirations for your family in the future, and the amount of time you spend in nature. And I don't want to cast too wide a net here, and I know everyone has a different experience, but those are very common things that crop up, and I think you could put them all under the category of people are trying to better themselves in more ways than just their bank account. And so there's a lot of overlap there with people that kind of are on the psychedelic pursuit and exploring those realms. And I just think it's awesome. And so I find that they balance each other well. So to answer your question a little bit more succinctly, I think I have stopped wandering a lot, and I'd love to find a place that valued, freedom and sovereignty that was settled already. I don't think we're there yet, but I think hopefully in our lifetimes that'll become clear and really put down some roots. But otherwise, I can't imagine being involved in anything more exciting right now. So, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be here for a while.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you bring up the psychedelic realm and some of the truths or things that unlocks. I think, before Bitcoin, I felt that things were fake. The world was fake. I was struggling with that. Was it a huge leap of faith with you to be, honest with people about your psychedelic explorations? And I'm getting at that more with, maybe with family, but also career wise. Did you feel that like you were putting your career off? I mean, were you, at that young age, you want to create wealth, you want to seize opportunities, and you also want to put to, regardless of how you feel about the external world, you kind of have to put out, your resume and talk about things. Was that a concern of yours at that point, to take that sojourn, and even share that with people?
It never was, and this may go back to the telling my mom, if I could just go to bed and we can deal with this in the morning. To me, the trade-off of not expressing how I truly felt about something was never worth it, and that's probably held me back in, at least financially, in my career or in different domains. I can't give you a specific reason why, but like I've never catered to that end, right? So like I think a lot of people cater to the end of climbing the corporate ladder or getting more money or whatever. Like the highest priority was that nobody felt that I wasn't telling them how I really felt about something, that I wasn't telling the truth, and not even for the other person. That's always been for me. I couldn't put up with being afraid to say something that I actually felt was valuable or that I believed in, and the most common place I bumped up against this was with my parents, right? Because I always felt like I was never crazy, right? I always felt I could logically justify and articulate why it is I was pursuing what I was pursuing. And even if those things were unconventional from a mainstream perspective, I still felt like I could justify them. And if you wanted to challenge me on them, I was more than happy to entertain it. But I think my parents and friends and stuff like that figured out early on that you better have your shit together if you're going to challenge me on certain things, right? The things that I've chosen to be vocal about or engage in, because I don't do things willy-nilly. Like I didn't just go down to the to use an obvious example, like my mom was terrified when I told her at 20 or 21 that I was going to go down to the rainforest for 3-4 months and take the most powerful psychedelic known to man and live in a hut with a shaman. Like, that's for some moms, that's a bit worrying.
And she can't run the numbers on the network there. That's what I get out of it. You're seeking truth, but you can't prove it to others in that realm. That's the differentiator for me on that sojourn of yours.
Yeah.
For anyone who takes that,
100%. But I would always just say, like, or what my point was there is, like, I didn't do that in an unprepared or irresponsible manner. Like I would spent the previous several months reading everything that was available, making sure that, I knew, like, there's certain elements of a trip like that of course you can't plan for, but like, I knew what I was doing. It wasn't by accident. I was going to seek something in particular. And that's, and that's what I did. And I could always, because of that, justify it. And, she or other people in my life may not have liked it or respected it or agreed with it, but that's always been irrelevant to me. So, that's it.
Yeah. I really want to touch on what you said about Bitcoin as a tool. And when you put it that way, it almost demystifies it for me in some regards. When I first heard that, it was sort of mystifying, but now it's demystifying. It's just a tool. And it's just what, you could take a hammer, you could build, or you could, destroy. And when you put it in that framework, do you think, Bitcoin is revelatory, or it's just something that we found in nature and we wanted it and now it's here? Is it almost something like, at some point when Bitcoin is just money, the conversations that we've been having around money dwindle a bit. You still got to educate people about money, saving for their future and stuff, but it's not so big a deal anymore. It's the thing we use. And so in that regard, do you think Bitcoin is a revelation or just something that we've been waiting for and now it's here?
That's a big one. I would say that first, on a very basic level, we won't be talking about Bitcoin in 50, 100 years, because it'll be so fundamental and foundational to the culture and society at that time that, it's not novel anymore. People don't really talk about the internet broadly anymore, right? As they did maybe in the early 90s. As for its, any tool, I guess we value any tool, maybe even revere tools, dependent upon what they permit. What are the possibilities that the tool represents, and to that degree, we revere them. And I think what's happening now is a lot of people that think about this, deeply, are starting to realize that this tool, like everything, all technology is a tool. I mean, anything outside of our physical bodies that we want to use to take action in the world is a tool, right? And I just think what's happening now is a lot of people are starting to understand what this tool represents for possibility, now and into the future. What kind of novel possibilities for action does this tool represent? And I think that's why the rabbit hole is so deep, and that's why the understanding money is so deep, because when you understand what we use money for and how it's evolved and the history of money and that kind of stuff, and its implications and the relationship individuals have with it and how it fosters the culture and the society on which that gets built on top of it, I think what we're realizing is that this tool represents a dramatically positive shift in how we relate to one another economically, and then of course as a collective, what kind of things grow on top of that. And so on that level, like, maybe it's just a tool, but everything speaks to us as more than just what it is, right? There's an affect to everything, and this is, you may just say value is subjective, right? So this acorn here that's on my table now, like, it kind of worthless to me. Is nothing, but to other people, they might really like it. And so what's going on there when people really value something, like what it quote unquote means to them, is a pretty, tricky question and a deep question. But I think it's what Bitcoin's going to end up doing is allowing us to explore further ourselves, right? About what it is, what human action, what the potential for human action and human coordination and cooperation is, and what can result from new and novel methods of interacting. And that may sound boring or mechanical, but I don't think it is. I mean, I think that's what we've been talking about, right? We've been talking about exploring our own consciousness, exploring the world, trying to tease out who and what we are and what we want to do with this opportunity that we have, as being human beings on Earth. And a tool like this dramatically expands those things on many different levels and domains. And that is a deeply, deeply meaningful thing. And I think that's part of the reason why it's being treated with such, reverence by the hardcores right now.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And something else you said earlier, on one of those events or podcasts, was that Bitcoin self-selects. And I'm kind of curious how, maybe Bitcoin changed your behavior. Because I find that you were, like my parents and maybe myself, like Bitcoiners before Bitcoin, trying to find that fair world, trying to match your internal with your externalities, trying to find that stasis, or that's kind of like that peaceful dynamic. So I'm kind of curious how it changed your behavior. And then, but you said something very early on in the show about, you interviewed Bobby Lee, and I remember Bobby Lee as not very familiar with, but was a heightened character in the earlier Bitcoin days. So that was a get. That was someone important to talk to at the time. He was prominent.
Mm-hmm.
But up until that point where you were talking, like interviewing wasn't a part of your job set per se. You were working, you came across Bitcoin, but now all of a sudden you're interviewing someone. So I'm kind of curious a little bit about that moment, how you came to change from just learning about Bitcoin to actually interviewing someone and thinking that was something that, I don't know why you thought that would bring you benefit. I'm not saying it doesn't. I interview people, it brings me tremendous benefit, but how you came to that notion that you would interview someone and how it's just changed your behavior personally.
Totally. Yeah. So to attack the first one, you're right. The cliche changes that get bandied around as like, what Bitcoiners do when they fall down the rabbit hole. Many of them had already been integrated, I guess, into my character and into my life. But, you cannot discount the impact and the power of hope. And not even just hope, like I was saying before, like not only that the future doesn't look so dark anymore, but that it looks really, really, really bright and exciting. Like that, I think part of the reason why it inspires change is because, like, if you don't have something drawing you forward, then the relevance of novel information that you encounter on a daily basis, and even your, kind of the radar you have up to, for your sensitivity to acquiring useful knowledge is dramatically diminished. Because if you don't see a reason to refine yourself now in order to function better in the future, if there's nothing pulling you forward, then you're going to be kind of numb. Your sensitivity is going to be much less to all the things that you could pick up in your environment that would make you more fit for the future. And I think this is part of the reason why so many people today treat their bodies and their minds really poorly. They consume junk television and Netflix and binge watch all this stuff, several hours a day. They stuff their face full of, shitty foods. Their consciousness is not sensitive to all the different cues and pieces of information and knowledge in their environment that might go toward making them more fit for the future. And so obviously time preference plays into this, but I just think when you don't see much on the horizon, there's no real natural impulse to make yourself more fit to take advantage of it. And if you see really not good stuff on the horizon, you're far more incentivized to kind of ignore the noise of information that you might use and just get your rocks off now, right? Just go for sensual pleasure. But if you see hope on the horizon, then it shines the spotlight back. And especially the more you learn about the relationship of money to the structure of society, and when you go down that Bitcoin rabbit hole and you see the potential for what it could create in the future, well, then the spotlight comes back on you and says, are you as ready as you could be to take advantage of that? Because that shit's going to be awesome. Are you ready? Like, are you taking care of yourself enough? Are you cultivating yourself physically, intellectually, spiritually, all these different ways in order to maximize the benefit of that thing that you now see on the horizon? And I think that's part of the reason why a lot of Bitcoiners are inspired to change in the ways that they have. And I think we're just at the beginning of this, man. Like, this wasn't really a big part of the narrative like 3-4 years ago. I mean, I would say that this whole like Bitcoin changes you thing, at least as it's experience, like talked about today, is like 2 years old, maybe a little bit longer, but it's really amazing how quickly it can take effect. And that's why I like to joke, what we're all going to be like at the next halving. That's, 3.5 or 3 years, more than 3 years away. Like, what are we going to look like then when people are reporting, I've talked to people that got in March of 2020, and 6 months later, they're telling me like all the different dramatic ways they changed their life in 6 months. I mean, what happens when it's a year, 2 years, 4 years? So I think that's that's one of the powerful impacts of hope, is that it actually, it sensitizes you to interact with your environment as though it had greater meaning because it now held greater purpose and prospects for a better future, whereas before it didn't. So I feel like that's one of the ways that it really tunes you to just act differently and treat your environment differently. What was the second part of that question?
To be honest, I was just really focused on what you were saying, and I lost the thread myself. But I want to say, before, my parents are Bitcoiners before Bitcoin. They lived for the future. They
Right.
always sacrificed today for tomorrow, and they sacrificed for themselves, for their children. I don't know what their lives were like before us. But I had despair, and I think that's why in my 20s I was just seeking pleasure. I wasn't, I'm not saying I was all about pleasure in the physical world, but I'm saying like I was living for today, and just trying to enhance myself. Like yourself, I spent 3 years actually after college, at one of the big four accounting firms, and I actually 5 years, and then I left to go on a 3-month journey through the South Pacific by myself, really just to chisel at myself. And there's nothing like, when you're a tourist and you're with people, you might go see the Grand Canyon, but it's like, what do you think? I don't know. What do you think? But when you're by yourself, it's like, I don't have to be here if I don't want to be here. It's why am I here?
Right.
Why am I doing whatever I'm doing? And, it's like before Bitcoin, the external world caused you to withdraw, and there were bright and dark spots. But one of the things, it's like now the future is brighter. But you did touch on this thing where you said in the Western world, we have a crisis of diseases of despair. And a lot of times when you hear news or narratives, you don't know if it's someone's opinion. You don't. Well, it's always someone's opinion, but there's some opinions you hold a little bit more closely or value. And so when you said something to that effect, it really struck a chord, because I see the despair. I don't know if it's greater than before. But I think what I was getting at before though is like, so in my 20s I'm wandering, but in my 30s I happened to get married. I fell in love. I found my wife, my soulmate, and I had children, and I kind of had to give the wandering up for them, and give my own despair up for them, and just get it done, right, and not bring it home, and figure out a way to get ahead. And it was a constant scramble, because you're doing the job, you're trying to figure it out, and things are always running away from you. But I had to just buckle down and figure it out. There's no excuses, right?
Yeah.
But when I found Bitcoin, things got a lot brighter, because I'm not going to say a way out, but I had control over what I'm going to say is my own money, in the sense that like no one could debase it. Not control, like I'm not even talking about censorability or seizability or any of those things, but like no one's going to F with my money. And that really changed my whole outlook, and so I'm just curious, like what your thoughts are on this crisis of despair, for people who haven't found Bitcoin. And when I say that, like, I don't want to make it sound like Bitcoin is their salvation, as much as it can be for us. Again, I think the salvation comes from within. And then we were looking for Bitcoin. That's why we found it. You said it before, Bitcoin self-selects, ideas have people. We had that idea in our head for some reason, that we needed to find a better way. But what do you make of the despair around the globe, and how real or actual or heavy that is?
Yeah. Well, as you said, I mean, it's difficult to compare something like that, because most people lead lives of quiet desperation, and as a result it's not broadcast, it's not a statistic, so it's difficult to compare that across timescales. But I think most people, if they're empathetic enough, if they're sensitive enough, if they're paying attention enough, they can see that there's a lot of it in the world today, and it's covered over in myriad ways, but like what I was saying earlier, I mean, like, people don't act like how they truly feel. They act how people expect them to feel, or people expect them to, and how they need to act to advance their position, whether that be familial, corporate, whatever, like whatever games they're in, they're acting in a manner that will advance their position in those games. And, on that note, you could say that fiat currency is creating a really kind of perverse meta game, and it's creating all these kind of avatars of people that are not acting in accord with who they truly are, but in accord with what the game requires of them. And, and I think, the last year has been really revealing of this. But, I'm empathetic. I try to be empathetic. And I think at a core level, we're all the same, and I think we've born in different locations to different families and different languages and all that kind of stuff. And as a result, we appear different, but I don't think there's anything really that separates us on a fundamental level. But there seems to be a lot of, there's people seem to be very confused, I guess is the nicest way to say it, and consumed by fear and not taking it upon themselves to construct their own worldview, but having one imposed on them. And they're willing, they're complicit in it, of course. You don't have to go that way, but most people do, and they end up being a shadow of themselves, and they end up being avatars of this extremely perverse system that we have. And look, I don't want to be exclusively critical of this. Like, obviously there are bright moments. Like, we could readily admit that, people are conditioned by the mainstream media and the nation state and the fiat currency regime. But when you have a nice moment at your kid's birthday, or when you have a beautiful moment with a loved one, or when a family member, like, there are pockets of pure, genuine joy and experience all over at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's, to me, that's real. There's nothing intermediating that experience, like when it happens, for real. But people seem to kind of, that's the exception. Most of the time, people kind of withdraw into the conditioned, culturally determined behavior that people have come to, I guess, believe is the most effective way of maneuvering themselves in this world. And I can't remember who said this quote, but I remember as a youngster, I said it to myself often, actually, as a way to console myself for being frustrated, and also curious why the world seems so weird to me. And maybe you'll know who said it, but it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. I want to say it was Krishnamurti, but I don't think it was him. But in any case, that kind of sums
Into the
it
Wild.
up.
Is that the kid from Into the Wild? Chris, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the name. Chris.
Oh no, I said it might be Jitta Krishnamurti, the philosopher, but I can't be sure about that one. But anyways, that was the quote, and that kind of, that was a bit of a mantra for me for a time, because I was seeing like a lot of what I thought was irrational, crazy behavior around me, and wondering why I didn't feel compelled to mimic it or to engage in the same type of behavior. And my assessment was the society is quite sick, and I didn't at the time know that the huge reason for that was the money. I just knew that was the case. And, mainstream media and government and all the rest, I knew those were all influences. And so, that quote and that way of thinking helped me maintain my steadfastness, perhaps, in not acquiescing and going into that. But to circle back to your question, I think there's a ton of it. I think is the system as it's structured right now, and the siphoning off of wealth surreptitiously from people, and also the macro structure of society and culture as a result of being predicated on this unfair monetary system that dominates globally, is definitely exacerbating the propensity to fall into despair and all the different downstream effects, the mental health issues and the substance abuse and the anger and the frustration and all of these things that are toxic to the individual and to relationships and to society. Obviously, they're all latent within us, but I think it exacerbates them tremendously. And so I think if we wound up on a different monetary standard, one that could not be corrupted, like Bitcoin, one that was fair for everybody, I think we'd see a lot less of that. And in fact, when I was working in natural health, mind-body medicine or psychophysiology was something that I was very interested in. And I've said this a bunch, only half jokingly, and I actually don't consider it a joke at all anymore. But I think for a therapist, someone in a therapeutic setting where they're dealing with these issues all the time now, I think it's critical that you include, education about Bitcoin into the therapeutic stack, because understanding, yeah, I mean, like a huge element of despair is looking out at your environment and like not feeling like it doesn't jive with you. It doesn't make sense, or it's overbearing, or there's no hope, or there's no place for you in it. You feel alienated and isolated and all this stuff. I feel like if you understood Bitcoin and what it meant for how the external world might change, that would dramatically change your perception of how well you can integrate with that external world. And I think that's a huge aspect of mental health issues. So I think it should be integrated into, the protocol stack, the therapeutic stack for mental health professionals. We're a long way off of that, but I think it should. So I see a lot less despair and mental health issues on a Bitcoin standard. I know for a fact that it's had dramatic impacts on Bitcoiners. I've talked with Bitcoiners, and they've said this publicly on shows I've done with them, that were, basically suicidal. I'm not going to dig into the reasons for that, but that was where they were at. And as a result of grokking Bitcoin and starting to see it, their life has completely turned around. Ended up coming out of that and starting a family and being more financially secure and having hope for the future. And this is a huge part, man, that we haven't touched on yet. But, we talk about Bitcoin as a tool and what kind of affect it has and why it draws out these behaviors and what it means for the future. But one thing that, is becoming a more and more clear element of this whole phenomenon is the people that are communicating with each other, the quote unquote community that's emerging, the culture around this thing. Like, I'm starting to think number go up is hands down what brings the most people in. But in a world that's increasingly divisive and tumultuous and conflict and vicious and all of this stuff, I think more and more people are going to be looking at this community of people that are hopeful for the future, committed to intellectual, refinement, and have very strong principles and integrity, and are expressing themselves genuinely, and also like to have fun. Like, I think, part of the reason why we, like you and I and everybody listening to this, feel good about being in Bitcoin is definitely the let's call it natural attributes of Bitcoin and what that means for how we can conduct our life. But it's also the fact that I can jump on a call with you now and I know we're exactly on the same wavelength. And I can do that. And I have done that with hundreds of other Bitcoiners. I do a lot of calls that are not broadcast. And it amazes me that every time I jump on one, it's like there's no lag. Like, we're immediately running right out of the gate. And for going back to that piece about feeling isolated, you on your journey, me on mine, we're kind of looking for meaning and being like, there's not many people that I feel like I have a connection with. Like, I'm really not jiving with a lot of people. And then to come into this thing and be like, holy shit, like now there's hundreds, if not thousands of people that I'm sure when we meet in real life, we're going to become, friends very quickly, and who are thinking like I do and are articulating themselves in a manner that I articulate myself. And there's so many similarities, and that's so powerful, man. The power of community. And I think that's one of the elements why there's so much despair, because people are increasingly cut off. But I think that's also why this phenomenon is going to be so therapeutic for people and draw so many people in, because they see this positive culture emerging from this thing and they're going to want to be a part of it.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And I really recognize that power of community. I don't think I've felt that at all since maybe college, when you're spending a lot of time with people and you really connect very quickly. I also related a lot to what you said about consumed, with fear. And, like I said, I made a commitment. I have a family. I was going to get through this thing no matter what. Not through this thing. I am going to get through this thing no matter what. And I'm going to do everything I can for them. But before Bitcoin, I can relate to that lack of control. and you're doing everything you can, but there's certain elements. There's this tool, there's money, the tool, the denominator is out of your control. But before we turn to the really fun stuff that I want to get into with you, I'd love to ask you a little bit about China and the 21st century, what you gleaned. You still seem, you haven't been there, or I don't know where you've been, but like you left living there in 2018. So it's about 3 years. But you still seem to have a lot of conviction about where they're pivoting to going forward, regardless of what Bitcoin does. And so I'm just kind of curious, like a little bit about what you saw in China and why you have this conviction about them being the leaders of the 21st century. I'm not getting into even whether that's good or bad. Just like, what is it about that kind of steers you in that direction, or that foresight?
Yeah. So any conversation of China is tainted with, the things, the evil, the bad things, the evils that the government gets up to, right? And I'm obviously no defender of what they do, but when I first looked at okay, when I first tried to understand the world, I mean, one question that comes to anybody who looks at this is like, why was the U.S. Why is like in our lifetimes the U.S. has been the dominant global power, right? Why? That's a pretty obvious question lurking out there. And I remember, I think it was in high school, or maybe it was a little bit after, but Jared Diamond wrote 2 books, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Collapse. And he was basically trying to illustrate or explore why the world ended up looking the way it looked. Why does Europe have all those countries that it has? Why is America there and Canada there? And the sovereign individual is probably an extension of that in the 20th and 21st century. But it basically looks at what are the factors, the technologies, the demographic factors, the geographic factors that lead to the world looking like the way it looks like. And obviously the way the world looks is in constant flux, even though right now it seems pretty set. But I mean, if you look at a map of, let's say, the geographic boundaries of Europe over the last 1,000 years, I mean, it's nothing but fragmentation and consolidation and fragmentation and consolidation and change. Like, that's just what we do. So why are we at where we are right now? And that, in addition to, China, I love ancient history. And of course, it's instrumental if you want to understand how the world has developed and how humanity has developed. And so ancient Egypt and ancient Sumeria and the Indus Valley civilizations and ancient China have always been, super interesting to me. And so China's always had, an extremely rich and extremely ancient culture, and a highly developed one. And they were kind of isolated from the world for a large part of their history. But, they were, as far as they were concerned, they were top dog for most of their history. They had the most highly advanced civilization that they knew of. And you can make a case that there was, ancient Chinese history and Chinese culture, pre 20th century is extremely rich and fascinating. But so I just looked at it and said, look, 1.3 billion people, the geography and the natural resources to support it. A change, they had a difficult time in the 20th century, a lot of tumult and changes, but things were coalescing into a more organized and efficient state now. And I remember when I first went there, everyone was like, oh, they'll never do anything but like copy, American or European goods, or like they're just not the same. Like they're a different breed. I'm like, what are you talking about? We're all just people responding to our environment. Like there's no difference between a Chinese person, an American person, an African person in what they're capable of as a human being. Right. It's all just them responding to their environment and their incentives and all that kind of stuff. So to me, it was very clear that, China's story was going to continue to unfold. And with a population like that, and as they became increasingly rich, and with the natural resources they had, and with a proud legacy of being an advanced dominant civilization in the world prior to the 20th century, like, I just felt like that was going to be the natural order of things. Like how ultimately, I know in the current geopolitical dynamic, you may say like, yeah, but the US military is like way, way bigger. It's like, yeah, well, so is the Spanish militaries and the Portuguese and the British and the fill in the blank, fill in the blank, fill in the blank. They have 1 billion more people than the U.S. They have a lot of space for them. They have resources in their own borders, and of course, they've been going all over the world buying resources. They're extremely hungry and driven and motivated people. There are no more entrepreneurial, capitalist-minded people I've ever come across in all my travels than Chinese people. And you know, the structure of government is deserving of a lot of criticism, especially from a freedom point of view. But one, I think a lot of Bitcoiners would be critical of the state apparatus in many jurisdictions. Like it's kind of like, it's not like one's good, one's bad. It's like it's degrees of bad that we're talking about. And as far as economic development is concerned, I'm a critic of central planning. I think the best way to foster, growth and innovation is as an emergent property of free markets. But I can't, and perhaps their development would have been better if they went that way. Who knows? But I can't knock the fact that, they've set the parameters of the game and then pretty much let the natural entrepreneurial energy of the people play it. And then, pour on some gasoline in different areas where they want to see more development. And I think based on that, maybe there's bubbles forming, but I think that the overarching story is how could you stop that? And even if we go on to a Bitcoin standard where, let's say, the playing field is fair and even for all countries in the world. And now the kicker here is the US is getting a massive head start on the world, presumably, at least as individuals, because Bitcoin is probably adopted more in the US than most other countries in the world. And that's awesome because that's going to be probably a huge determining factor in the future. I also suspect that the PBOC is actually and has been accumulating Bitcoin, but that's pure speculation. That's my own, feeling about how they operate. But if the world is operating on a even playing field and people can't manipulate their currencies, and it's strictly a matter of who produces the most and best things that the global market wants, I think China wins at that game ultimately. Now, one of the things that may influence that, and one that I'm really excited about, because I don't like the prospect of any one massive country having a huge, asymmetry of power in the world. I think this shift toward, to umbrella term, the means of production shifting to a local basis. So, with the advent of 3D printing and with, all the stuff we're seeing now, an individual can generate their own power. They can grow their own food. They can make their own tables and chairs. Like, we're not there yet, but that seems to be the trend, that like production is coming down to the individual level. And I'm sure there will be other things that people end up doing, but I'm hoping that brings the locus of power back to the individual, and the efficiency gains of these massive states, these centrally controlled massive states that kind of try to control economies, will diminish. And if that's the case, maybe that influences how the geopolitical winds blow and what changes take place. But if things kind of remain on the current trajectory, I just think people, geography, level of wealth now, organization, I think it's just kind of natural that China will be the dominant player in the future, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I just want to, a little bit before we again turn to the really fun stuff, just turn to that notion of China as the future. So do you think that, they're outplaying us by the fact that, through central planning, or through the fact that they have 5,000 years of wisdom? And I'm only going to buttress that up to, or contrast that to, the fact that and I didn't run the numbers on this, I'm not a historical expert, but it seems like they moved to the gold standards a little slower than other nations, and that caused their civilization a lot of time. So I don't know if they'll get everything right. And I'm just coming at this agnostic. I don't know. So I'm just curious what you think. But do you think their locus of power comes from the history, or from the fact that they're more centralized planning? And maybe we could even argue that other states are just as centralized. I'm not, but in the notion of centralization, or is it a combination of both? I'm just curious
Yeah,
what you think.
I it's a weird, it without speaking to, I don't mean to disrespect them, but it's a weird mentality that they have because like we just simply can't appreciate what the 20th century was like for mainland Chinese people. Like, fill in your number, 50 million, 100 million dead of starvation, under Mao, right? And then the Cultural Revolution where like all that stuff about the past, because they felt like the world had become modern and they had lagged behind. And so the quote unquote great leap forward was basically do away with history, all that tradition that's holding us back. We've got to modernize and move forward. And so they destroyed, ancient monuments and, ancient, they tried to basically
Yeah.
destroy the culture so that nobody would be focusing on that and everyone would be aligned on moving forward. And, under that form of communism, and that was horrible, right? And like the
Right.
society at that time was, and like when I went there in 2009, and probably even today in certain pockets, but increasingly rare. But when I went there in 2009, like you could still see vestiges of like the abject poverty and the kind of toll it took on people's mentality, to the point where now still the cultural mentality of the people is like it's a bit weird. Now, like if you're under 40, um, that's less and less the case, but there's still a generation of people alive today, people that are 40 plus that experienced a lot of that stuff. And so on the one hand, they know that they had this glorious past, this rich culture, but they also know that it was like basically shaken out of them. And so now the national identity, I mean, they're very nationalistic people, right? And obviously they've been propagandized and all that kind of stuff, but like, basically they think this is China reascending, right? And the opportunity is right there in front of them, and they want to get after it, both for themselves and for the quote unquote glory of the nation. And so that's how people feel. And for younger people, and to kind of answer the question about how I feel it'll shake out, like regardless of central planning and government structure and Bitcoin or fiat currency or whatever, the people the people under 40 that I knew in China, and it was pretty consistent this way, was I meet them and you can see it in their eyes that they're like, they're curious about the world, right? Like they want to learn about the world. They want to travel. They want to educate themselves. They want to dress well. They want to kick ass in their chosen field. Like they're really well put together people that are like focused on eyes on the prize, right? Like they know that a better life awaits. They know the opportunity. They want to get after it because it's been held back from them for so long. Versus in the Western world, obviously, as a result of having had it for so long, there's an element of complacency, obviously to varying degrees in different people. But, and I hate to be too critical of our culture, but a big portion of the culture like goes to work so they can come home, watch Netflix and chill out on the sofa until it's time to go to bed. Like there's not much drive beyond doing what is necessary to get by. And in China, like, honestly, man, like that's why cities like Shanghai and Beijing and Shenzhen and all these centers have such a strong energy because everyone is after it really hard. And that's a tough thing to be. Like people will work their goddamn asses off. It doesn't matter what the job is. Like there is just such a hustle and bustle there, and I don't feel like that's going to stop anytime soon. So I think that'll feed into the economic and geopolitical dynamic that plays out.
Yeah, it's great insight. Before we turn to your awesome article, After an Unforgettable Year, I'm Most Bullish on Bitcoiners. I really want to bring up one of your other pieces that you published on Twitter. It was just a great post. This was on December 16th. Just fuck me already, Bitcoin. John, this broke me. I didn't see it on December 16th. I was researching you. I went down your timeline. This just absolutely floored me. I think this took absolute balls and chutzpah to post. I'm a married man. My wife would throw me out of the house if I posted this. but I want to know what you were getting at. What feeling you were
Well,
trying to capture.
well, I mean, what I was capturing is Bitcoin was flirting with its all-time high, and it had been, flirting there for a while. And I mean, when you're a younger man, perhaps, and you're doing these traveling around the world, you come across, the odd lady, and there's an element of playfulness and teasing and stuff, and you, maybe we've all been in a situation where like the foreplay is done, and you want to get on with it. So, and even I think that tweet in particular was obviously spoken from the female side of things. If we're going to frame it up that way. But no, it was like, Bitcoin has been flirting with the all-time high. Like, come on, let's go. And what's funny about that tweet is I don't think it was long after, might have been minutes, but I don't think it was more than an hour, but things really rocketed up after that one, which is why I think it became kind of a funny tweet, because seemed like it was speaking to the gods of Bitcoin, or speaking to Satoshi or something like that.
Yeah, it reminds me of something. I used to listen to the Michael Rappaport podcast before I got a little sick of him, and he would say, "You fuck you," and you could interpret that in so many different ways. And it just really floored me, and I really applaud you for tweeting it out. So I'm going to ask you, why are you so bullish on Bitcoiners?
Well, I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of it in the course of this conversation, but to me, it just keeps coming back to what we were saying. I mean, Bitcoin is an amazing tool and represents so much possibility, but it's us who use the tools, right? And we shape our tools, and we are shaped by our tools. And so the story here is the changes in behavior, the changes in the methods and ways in which we interact with one another, and in which we interact with our future selves, of course. That's the story here. That's the phenomenon. The attention gets placed on Bitcoin, obviously, because it's the novel tool that's emerged to let all this happen. But we are the story here, and the changes that people, that happen in people as a result of this tool emerging, and obviously importantly using this tool to maximum effect, it kind of to its maximum potential. The effects it has on individuals and the community that creates, I mean, that's the phenomenon. I mean, how could it be any other way? I mean, Bitcoin is just a nothing burger if we don't use it and engage with it to actually interact in novel ways, right? And so that's kind of what I was getting at with that article, and the fact that I've just been, I guess, as a result of that being true, or as proof that that is true, I've had the good fortune to interact with so many Bitcoiners through the podcast and through other means, and hearing the stories of genuine transformation. And irregardless of age, sex, creed, nationality, whatever. I mean, I often come back to the example of Michael Saylor. It can't just be the fact that like people are getting wealthier as a result of owning Bitcoin and the price going up, because here's a guy who was already extremely wealthy, and once he went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, like it's very apparent all over his face, and his like that you can tell that this guy was changed by this thing. I think he was probably, we were discussing before, like a bit of aimlessness, a bit of despair as a result of like kind of thinking, is this it? Like, is this all there is, world, that you got for me? And then having this thing emerge and having the world expand as a result of this thing emerging, right? Our worlds have expanded dramatically as a result of this new tool. And people seem to be changing in dramatic and consistent ways as a result of the emergence of that tool, and going back to that phenomenon of our tools shaping us. And so, and it also goes back to what I was saying about the psychedelic, when I was kind of hanging my hat on, the psychedelic, the capacity for or the change in consciousness or mindset to change the world, there was no real tool to foster that en masse. And with Bitcoin now, I think we have one. And by whatever means you come in, number go up, or the community, or sovereignty, or, protecting from inflation, or whatever, I think if you stay with it, like if you pay enough attention to it, it starts to change you. I mean, this is a very consistent message in the community is Bitcoin changes you. And I'm so stoked by the type of changes that I see in people. And to a certain degree, I've seen in myself. Like that's how the world gets better is people, upgrade people, upgrade the world. We always say fix the money, fix the world, right? But it really is, upgrade people, upgrade the world, because that's all the world is. It's just us here on this rock. And so and like I've met I can't say it enough, man. Like I I've had had very good fortune to have very good friends and relationships in my life, family and friends and stuff. I'm like, I got a lot of love in my life, but it's definitely been the case that I've always been a bit of felt somewhat isolated intellectually, let's say. And now to see all these people from all over the world having kind of a simultaneous awakening. And like I was saying earlier, I mean, I could just pick up the phone and talk to them like we've known each other for 10 years, kind of like what we're doing right now, as a result of the seemingly consistent changes that this thing engenders in people is nothing short of amazing. So, both on a larger macro scale of seeing these positive changes in individuals, but also on a selfish individual scale saying, man, like the number of people that I feel connected to now has grown exponentially, has exploded as a result of Bitcoin and my involvement in it. And I think that's the case for a lot of Bitcoiners. Like their world, the connection, again, back to that despair component, like that's one of the things that make human beings happy is genuine connection with other human beings. And the fact that Bitcoin is fostering that with like a lot of other people is amazing. And I think we're just starting to see the effects.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add on that tip is, I'm amazed by the connections and the instant vibe, and I think that it speaks to, I didn't make connections like this, and I stopped making connections like this when I graduated college, and pre-graduating college, my world was guaranteed in terms of I just did what I had to do, and everything was paid for in terms of either loans or financial assistance from my parents. And then I was out on my own, and the world was running away from me, and it's a lot harder to connect people in an unfair world and where no one has time to spend on each other, but one of the things that, like I said before, I think you're the dopest, freshest Bitcoiner in my mind this year. We all have, a long-standing people that have influenced us and really relate to or gleaned a lot from. But in this past year of my exploring, especially as a podcaster, there's no one I want to hear more than you. I really enjoy your outlook, especially when, I love your podcast, but I love hearing you outside of your podcast because I get to hear you, and you speaking on it instead of you asking questions. But I don't want to hear anyone else ask questions beside you. I love your questions, but I love your answers too. But
oh, man, I really appreciate that, for real.
Yeah, man. Well, that's the truth. So, we got this new thing up around here now, which is Bitcoin Clubhouse, and I have mixed feelings about Bitcoin Clubhouse. Not bad, but like, I don't think it's like going to the opera. It's not a polished show. It's not a one-on-one deep, heavy conversation. But I like the fire. I like the ephemeral spontaneity. I like the ability to connect. And I think you were in there for the first time yesterday. I'm not sure when your first time was, but I did get to hear you in the Peter Schiff room. And I'm not trying to get into the Peter Schiff thing too much, but I just loved hearing you. But I also, I really enjoyed your question for him. And so I'll speak it out a little bit from what I remember. I'll paraphrase, but you asked him, Peter, what would it take for you to understand and or admit that other people know something you don't or understand something you don't? And he, jammered and didn't really answer that question. And I appreciated the fact that he said that doesn't really answer the question. But I want to know from you, what did you take of that interaction? And I'm not talking about the audience that was listening, because I think it was profound for the audience if they were actually critically thinking. But what did you take from that? Did you enjoy that interaction or whatever?
Well, I mean, I was cooking beef when Corey called me up, so I was entirely unprepared. I mean, I was just lurking, right? I was just in the audience listening to it all go down. So I wasn't prepared, but like, look, we all feel the same about Peter, right? I mean, he's out of his goddamn mind. And there's no convincing him clearly. So I didn't want to go in with something like, how can you say intrinsic value? We all know value is subjective, or something like that, because none of that plays with Peter. So I tried to ask a question that maybe got away from speaking past each other on specific terms and stuff like that. I knew he would do his typical thing and route around it. But I just kind of wanted to hear him admit. And I think, I think he did kind of show his hand, because I said, what would it take for you to, I said something about ego and hubris. And like, if we really want to learn, we have to engage in discourse where we genuinely allow for the possibility that the person we're speaking with might understand something that we don't. I mean, what is the point of conversation if you're not going to grant that to the person you're speaking with? And his answer was, yeah, but what is it that I don't know? And I think everyone in the audience, that's exactly right. That's exactly characterizes his entire perspective and his approach to this. I think maybe in hindsight, a better question would have been just simply like, have you ever read cover to cover a book about Bitcoin? And I think his answer would be no. And then, I think it would be great to say to him, like, you're speaking from a position of presumed authority on the subject. And there's a certain cohort of people that actually value your opinion and are listening to you as if you are educated on the subject. And if you haven't even taken any time to educate yourself on the subject, when anyone in the space will tell you that it takes a lot of self-education to really come to understand what this thing is. I mean, every Bitcoiner I talk to is like, half my day is trying to continue to try to understand and learn about this thing. And certainly when you first got into it, you were probably set on fire and just consumed every resource you get your hands on. And for you not to do that, but still presume to speak from a position of authority, is a profound moral failing on your part. And, so if I had my time back, I maybe would have went that route. But I think, at this point and for a long time, the only reason why I don't get a ton of enjoyment out of it is because I don't like that people are being misguided by his opinion. But as far as entertainment value, I kind of love that he's around, that he's just this irrational holdout that's kind of never going to capitulate, that we can kind of just use as a punching bag for fun as we march towards hyper Bitcoinization. And it makes the process fun. I mean, this isn't all serious at the end of the day. I mean, no good revolution doesn't have some fun mixed into it. And this is a revolution, and us Bitcoiners got to get our kicks somewhere. And I think Peter Schiff is probably one of them.
Yeah, word up. I agree. I really, vacillate between, playing with the foil or just leave him alone. And I still think he's worth playing with, because I do think he is listening and rejecting consciously and not willfully ignorant. But we'll see.
It's funny to see his son, dunk on him in the
yeah.
post
I
he
think
makes now.
it's a scam. I think that he's selling gold out the front door and his son's buying Bitcoin out the back. And one day he's going to turn around and say, my son's taking over the business and we're going to go sell the Bitcoin out the front door. And it's not my fault. It's what he wants to do. And the whole ride there.
You think Peter's accumulating right now?
I do. And if he's not, he's an idiot, but I do.
Well, see, I get such a kick out of this.
But I believed him when he was talking to you. I didn't think he was lying when I heard him in real life. So I don't know. And you know what? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because Peter Schiff's another brick in the wall. It
totally doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. And that's why I'm more inclined to leave him alone. But I like fucking with him too. I'll go at him on Twitter. And I don't mind, because it's entertainment for me. But I do think it's a scam. Just like everyone's a scammer.
Well, I agree with that. And he's definitely, obviously, engagement farming,
Yes,
but
he's
I honestly think
that's the number one scam.
Right. But Occam's razor, right, is that like he's accumulating, and that's what a lot of people say on Twitter, but I actually don't think that's the case. Like, I think he's literally that stubborn or crazy or whatever you want to call it.
I would love that.
And he's that close-minded to it that he's really being serious. And yes, he's engagement farming from Bitcoiners so that he can grow his, gold business. But I think he's actually that crazy. And that's hard for a lot of us to believe because it's so goddamn obvious to us, right? Like the case for Bitcoin is like, it's not even a counterculture and it's not even a contrarian bet anymore. I mean, BlackRock and Bank of New York Mellon and, corporates, Tesla, like it's not a contrarian bet, but I still think he's
I don't know.
And,
Listen, I don't know. I didn't mean to say listen, but I never heard of Peter before Bitcoin. I wasn't a gold bug. I knew gold was better than dollars, but I wasn't buying gold. And my feeling on this is that, and it's completely uninformed, but his daddy showed him the gold business, and his son, he either expects his son to listen to him or he's going to listen to his son because his son is right. And I think that there's a chain of command here. And but I don't know, and I'm fine with it. If he doesn't accumulate, so be it. But I do think he's engagement farming. I do think he knows, and that to me says that he knows the power of Bitcoin because it's bringing him more engagement. And engagement is dollars. Engagement is purchasing power. Engagement is everything. So I think he knows. I think he might consciously refute it in public, but I think deep down in his heart, he knows. And that's why I want to walk away from the discussion. The same way I don't care about Elon, and I don't even care about Michael Saylor. Like, the individual doesn't matter in this. That we would buy stocks if the individual, if we were betting on a person. So but
you're 100% right.
Yeah, and I love that you asked the best question possible, because you were brought up for a question, and I didn't know if you was sitting on it or you came up with it on the spot, but it was the best question. It was a question of like, what would it take for you to admit you're wrong? And what number, what fact, what data point? And he talked about, he lost money, he lost his password, Voorhees didn't set him up right. I mean, it didn't go anywhere, and it wasn't. He had no ground to stand on. And one of the things he said was, "I still regret that I didn't buy it at $10." So you understand. To me, it's very clear that
he said, "I regret." Nobody convinced me to buy it at $10, and I'm like,
whatever,
dude.
It's someone else, right? Yes, someone else. So, but I think his son's smart as a whip. I think most people are smart as a whip, and they just got to choose to exercise it. And he's a smart dude, and his son's probably smarter or just as smart. And I think he's listening to his son. I don't buy it at all. I think he's trying to play both sides of his mouth.
You know what? This brings up a broader point, and I guess my question was somewhat addressing this, that when we talk about what kind of changes Bitcoin is going to have and what kind of impacts it's going to have, and this is clearly evident in the Bitcoin community, at least in as far as it's represented on Twitter, is that I'm hoping, and I think you can observe this now, that as people are able to opt out of the old system, the old job, like you asked me, like, was I afraid of, speaking my mind? When people are less and less afraid of speaking their mind, like how they really feel, because they're not afraid of the consequences, they're not afraid of the axe falling, like they are sovereign, right? When you're sovereign, you can say what you want and not be afraid of the consequences. What I'm hoping that what comes from that, among other things, is that people will both develop for lack of a better term, better principles and values internally, and will hold people to account more, will judge people more on their principles and values rather than just their position or their wealth or whatever. And so, like, I do think we see that in Bitcoin Twitter, where, like, sure, you can be successful, you can be rich, you can be whatever, but if you're caught, being disingenuous, being dishonest, promoting something that's totally self-serving, or all these things, people get called out. And I love that. I hope we see more of that. And I think, Bitcoin is a great tool for that as well, because it kind of shines a spotlight on bullshit. And I think someone like Peter Schiff, and that's kind of why I asked that question, is because, like, it is a moral issue that you don't engage in conversation as though the person you're speaking to had anything from which you could learn, right? To presume that your knowledge is complete, that's a moral failing. And I hope that as we become more sovereign, our lips become looser, but our conviction and our principles and our values become stronger, and we hold people to account more on those variables, not on the typical ones of status and wealth and that kind of stuff. And I see that that's what happens now in the very small Bitcoin Twitter community, and I think I'm hoping that proliferates further.
Yeah. Before Bitcoin, I was an eternal optimist who was always pessimistic. Now,
How do you
always.
explain that?
I explain that because I think that I can always overcome anything in my way. I have a lot of faith in myself.
So you can overcome anything, but the situation
was
daunting,
just always getting dire and always getting worse.
Right.
And no one was hearing it. No one was waking up to it. And to be honest, I think it's going to take a generation and a half for people to recognize and reflect on Bitcoin and change their behavior in mass. I think we're not a select few, like we're special. I'm not trying to say we're special, but we're early is what I mean. And I don't think it's permeating as quickly, even if people make gains. What this thing is, that is a tool that it could change their behavior, that it will change their behavior. But I do think that they will be forced to change their behavior, and it will take a generation and a half. It'll take our children, and even our children will be subjected to what their parents think of for the last 5 years and the next 10 years or 5 years. And I don't think everyone's coming around very quickly. Most people think of it as still as magic internet money, Super Mario coins. It's not real. They don't see their dollar shrinking, or they get stocks, and the stocks go up 20% a year, and that's good enough, even though that's keeping up with inflation. I don't have a lot of faith. I'm an eternal optimist. I think it's going to work out. I think we now have the tool to solve this problem for ourselves, but I think it's going to take a long time for it to affect people in mass. But that being said, for me, it's been eye-opening because, I now feel freedom that I've never felt before. And freedom that, comes from being able to grasp something that I couldn't get in my hands before. And now I have it, and no one can take it away from me. Metaphorically, I could lose it, I could spend it, but no one can take it from me. No one could debase it. And that's a really big deal. But I'm really, so now I'm an eternal optimist, but I'm a little bit more outwardly, or inwardly pessimistic about everyone getting on board.
Yeah.
But now I'm very optimistic for myself. I get the keys in my hand. And before this, I was afraid that I would never get the keys in my hand, that it would always be out of my reach, and that I would always have to do someone else's bidding to get there. Now the bidding is my own.
100%. I mean, and I think we all try to manage our expectations on this stuff so that we're not, disappointed at how fast things progress.
And I
would say, but I would say that freedom is at first scary, and then it's intoxicating. And that's been my experience. And I think because freedom is the assumption of responsibility, right? And so I think that at first is very scary. People are not used to that. But once you do it and you get comfortable with it, then you just want to do it everywhere.
Yeah.
Like you get addicted to that sense of freedom and sovereignty. 100%. And so I think that's what's going on. I think once this narrative really breaks through, like what's happening in the macro landscape and what Bitcoin represents, I can see scenarios where it happens way quicker than we all might expect. But I do try to remind myself that, as is often said in the space, that the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. But another way I look at it is everything is always in flux. There is no stasis, right? So when I try to imagine a future point in time where the Bitcoin Renaissance is well underway, like I try not to look at reality in terms of where we are as a static current moment and where we will be as a static future moment. Like it will always be underway. There will always be more things we're striving for, more things that are changing. Like that's just the way it is. So when I think about like, when will this happen? When will it be adopted? When will people change? Well, the answer is, some people and a growing group of people are actually having the transformation now. And that's awesome. And look at this great community that's growing up as a result of it. Other people, it'll take them another 5 years, and then they'll come in, and another 10 years, another 50 years, So it's always, we don't want everything to be the same everywhere at the same time, right? And that could never be the case anyways. So, and I think that's maybe an outlook that allows you to be a little bit more accepting of the ups and downs and the unexpected things that the flow of time throws at you, because you kind of like, I'm not going to hang all my hopes and dreams on some imagined reality coming to pass in the future, because there's no getting there anyways. I'll just be passing through that place if it even happens at all, So that's why I speaking about principles and values and this journey that we seem to have both been on when we were younger, of just kind of trying to find ourselves and find meaning and understand the world. I think part of the reason we do that is because we know that there's something inside of us, though, and perhaps in that realm of things, that can be immutable and unchanging, right? Like that I know who I'm going to be and the principles that are going to guide me and the values that I'm going to hold, irrespective of the circumstances that surround me, right? And there's something really liberating about that, because it's saying that, like, no matter what happens in the world, no matter what happens in my environment, those things are still, those are my anchor. Those are me. And I think that's powerful in a way that maybe I can't really explain right now, but it gives you some sense of comfort maybe about the chaos of the external world, and having, a kind of a North Star to guide you through all of that. And, maybe that's part of the function that religion has served in the past. And maybe that's part of the function or the reason behind, motivation behind spiritual seeking and that sort of stuff. But I think that's one of the main benefits of taking the time, or being on a continuous journey of self-understanding and refinement, is finding those things about yourself that you kind of know are immutable and unchanging, and using them to give you some level of comfort about the uncertainty of the future and the world around you.
Yeah. I just want to sound out on you. So I'm going to leave the parting words to you. I really just agree with everything you said. And I just want to ask you, like, where do you think you're going? Where do you want to be in 20 years? Almost aside from Bitcoin, like, what would be meaningful to you to accomplish over the next 20 years? Not where you want to start in 20 years, but like, what would be meaningful to you? And that could include Bitcoin, of course. But how do you want to spend your time?
That's a great and tough question. I think I have two-part answer to that. One is, that's a question that I've kind of, or maybe we all obsess over as we go through life, because we want to have some idea of what the future holds and what, the best use of our time is, and what's going to make us feel the best about life in general. And I think this has been largely a result of Bitcoin. I don't think I answered, earlier when you asked me what specifically behaviors have changed in me as a result of Bitcoin. But I think part of it is letting go into kind of a faith that if you can just show up as yourself with your genuine curiosity, and not be afraid to speak the truth, and connect with people that like-minded people that you think are good people and you want to connect with, like, if you do all that and you have a faith to push into that, then I kind of feel like the result of that is what the best you could hope for. So I could say, like, well, I want to be the head of $1 billion media company in 20 years, but that's just arbitrary. Like I that's just giving an answer. And I'm starting to realize, like, the best thing for me to follow internally is what gives me energy when I do it. What feels right, what aligns with my principles, what do I really enjoy doing? And don't get me wrong, I'm just beginning to understand how to interpret that and push into it, because most of my life has been like, I've always been a bit spontaneous, but like I've tried to graft an imagined future onto my life in my past, and I think that's shifting a bit now to just saying, look, I have a certain degree of freedom. I really am interested in certain things. I just want to be myself and see what happens, basically. But the a bit more of a detailed answer is, I love spending time with people. So I'll paint you my ideal scenario.
Sure.
And that'll probably, picture says 1,000 words. But at some point in the future, I'd love to be in a natural environment, whether it's rural Canada, rural Mexico, rural Thailand, wherever, just a beautiful environment, mountains, beaches, lakes, rivers, that kind of thing. And have a place that's set up, first of all, for the things I love to do. So I love to train like Muay Thai and MMA and, work out and go for swims and go for hikes and like just be active and in nature and that kind of thing, and be with others who are doing the same, because I love the vibe when you're doing something difficult together, and then afterwards you hang out and you talk about how hard it was, and the camaraderie there, and have it be an environment where people can come and have these peak experiences that I've explored in the psychedelic realm. So basically combining health and fitness and wellness with these peak experiences that I think are incredibly beneficial and therapeutic to people. And then miking up and having, whatever conversation we like to have. I mean, you also asked me earlier why I interviewed Bobby the first time. And the answer is twofold. One, his office was, I could see his office from my apartment window. It was right across the street. But the other answer was, even at that time, it wasn't only Bitcoin focused, but I was working in Shanghai and I was like, this is not enough. Like, my job is not satisfying me. And there's the tech industry was really booming there at the time and really getting underway. And I liked that industry because I felt it was solutions oriented and it was building solutions to our problems rather than just complaining about them. And I was like, I'm going to, reach out to these people and say, how about we record a chat, and that's a weird thing to do. And, I got a lot of no's, but once I got the ball rolling and I, people realized I wasn't crazy, then I would get referrals from people and say, do you know anybody else doing interesting stuff? And Bobby was I'm not sure if Bobby was a referral or if I hit him up. I think I hit him up individually and he referred me to some other people. But yeah, man, what's better than hanging out with someone and feeling good and then miking up with no time horizon and saying like, what do you want to explore? Like, let's hit it. Let's go deep in any direction and see what we come up with. And maybe we don't come up with anything novel and we just connect, or maybe we do come up with something unique and we both learn something. Like, that's kind of the ideal day for me. And then of course, family and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's what the vision looks like right now. We'll see how it turns out. But so I think that's a vague kind of goal, but the guiding force, I think, is just, we are all starting to have this opportunity where we really can experience what freedom and sovereignty is. And I think we should take advantage of that by allowing ourselves to be who we are and continue to try to understand what and who that is and shove it out there in the world and see what happens.
Yeah. John, this has been so wild. I've really enjoyed this. I could listen to you forever. I want you to share with people where they could find you. They definitely should check out the Bitcoin Rapid Fire podcast. You got 2 segments there where you do full chats with people, I believe, and you got the fire, where like you can just kind of get a quick glimpse of someone. But definitely share with people.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah,
I got a question for you. So I started that because like you said, I wanted to do kind of an open conversation and then do some rapid fire questions at the end, just to kind of delve into people's minds, a bit of human interest. And it actually is kind of fun to hear how different people answer kind of rapid fire questions. Although I've given it up recently just because I more enjoy the open conversation. But I've been thinking lately, like if I'm just having long form discussions with people, like 2-hour discussions, then a podcast titled Rapid Fire may be somewhat misleading or confusing. What do you think about what's in a name for you?
Yeah, man, I'm going to leave all this out of the chat, but like, I think that, it's confusing to me in the sense,
if you want.
But I think that the title's not confusing to me, but it's a dilemma because it's like, do I get 30 minutes of this dude and sum it up, or do I go the full 2 hours? And I would probably put it in 2 separate channels. just because I don't think that one takes away from the other. But as someone who I always want to go full bore, me personally, and that like that rapid fire, I'm like, well, maybe I could just cheat code it, So it's a dilemma for me. But at the end of the day, man, like I love what you're doing. I love both of them, and I don't care. I mean, like, what do we care? Like, if people want to listen to the rapid fire, they'll listen to that one. If they want to listen to long form, they will listen to it. And you see the numbers, but like I like the long form for me because that's just more meaningful for me. And the short form has a purpose. I'm not saying it doesn't, because like there's like, oh, I want to know what get the quick fire, what do they think about this, what do they think about that? But like I lean towards the long form. But if I see both, maybe I'll jump on the short form and skip the long form. I don't know, but like, dude, seriously, like I really just want to hear you everywhere. I don't even want to hear you interview people. I want to, and I love your interviews. So I'm not saying that, keep interviewing people, but like, I love hearing you, and what your thoughts are. And I think that it's really hard to get that across in an interview, because you could share, but like, I just want to hear you speak. I think that you have a really interesting perspective on this outside of money, you're on that philosophical bent. What is this doing for us? Because at the end of the day, it's a tool, and it's just a tool. It's maybe the greatest tool we've ever invented, but like, I don't know, maybe fire is, maybe the printing press is, maybe the internet is. Like, I don't know how it's going to play out over the next 5,000 years. What made one thing more important than the other? I mean, you can't have Bitcoin probably without the internet. Totally. So but like, the internet without Bitcoin is not much the way it's gone. So, I don't know, but I love hearing you talk about things. I love the way you ask questions. I thought the way you cut into Schiff was gold. I'm done with him now. I've been done with him for a while, but I was like, after John asked that question, there's no more. It's pointless until he's willing to acknowledge the question you're actually asking. And that's what you're doing all day long. So I'm just enamored with you. We didn't get into a lot of things, but you live in Thailand. You're in Newfoundland now. You're from there. You can't get home. You're a wanderer, but you're settling down. I think it's wild, man. And I'm so glad we connected. I really enjoyed our conversation. It's just, I want to hear more from you. Clubhouse is a different animal. Because like it's more talk radio, and it's more noob to expert, and once in a while these experts get into expert conversations about different topics, and I love the combination of people there. But at the end of the day, it's not as fulfilling to me. It's kind of like reality TV. Like I could jump in and just waste some time here. I go there to veg out, actually, to listen to other people, to be entertained. I don't go there to share, my thoughts, because I'm just happy to hear everyone else's. And I was happy to hear you but you get the opportunity to ask Peter a real question in a live format that he couldn't sidestep without his own words, and edit out. So that was dope. And I just want to hear you everywhere. I loved your article in Bitcoin Magazine. I like your take on things. I'm just so happy we got to connect.
Yeah, man. So, I mean, again, I really appreciate the kind words, and I'm stoked that we got to connect too. And I agree with the Clubhouse stuff. I drop in every now and then, and oftentimes I just find myself being like, man, I've heard this shit before, or it's the same person who loves to hear the sound of their own voice. And I love that there's a lot of orange pilling going on there, but I think it could become it is an interesting platform, but this is what I live for, right? Like you get to dial in with a person or a group of people, and you really get to take the conversation somewhere, like I'm doing one with Breedlove and Richard James next week, and it's looking at Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning. And we're just going to explore that book and probably relate it to Bitcoin to varying degrees. And that's the stuff, that I really enjoy, because like I said about, my future, like I'd love it if that could be part of my day, these intellectual conversations where we kind of ask the big questions and try to foil around and fumble around with them and try to use each other to help refine them for ourselves. I mean, that's what gets me off. So, the social media domain is fun, and we like to have fun there and banter and other stuff, but I love this, and man, I couldn't tell you how much I appreciate the work that you're doing. I love your work as well, and also for having me on for this chat. It's been awesome.
Well, I'm just really appreciative you said that. That means a lot to me. I'm going to leave it to you for parting words, and just include where people can find you, your podcast, and any writings you have or anything you want to share.
Yeah, sure. The podcast is Bitcoin Rapid Fire. It's available at all the normal places. The best way to interact with me is probably on Twitter. My handle is John, John K Vallis, Vallis. And that's it, man. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, it's so dope. I hope I see you in Clubhouse. I just kind of see it as like, I think it's here to stay. I think it's a wild format. I think someone said it in Clubhouse. I think it's the pre-party and the after party. Like I could see and I think they're going to roll out features like you could do your podcast in there and they'll record it. And you could have a pre-party and an after party and people spill out. But the opera is the opera. The show is the show. I don't think it will surpass that, But 100%, man, this has been so dope to connect. I'm just so happy we got to do this, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, me too, brother. I appreciate it.
All right. Peace.
John Vallis on truth, freedom, curiosity, possibility, and why he's so fucking bullish on Bitcoiners and Bitcoin, right here on the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. And thank you for listening. If you dug the chat, please subscribe and share with your friends and family. That's the best way to get the word out, so I can keep grinding out thought-provoking conversations on Bitcoin. This is Cedric. Peace.